This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. I'm Andy Steele, the host. Tonight we're going to be joined by Ted Walter, David Mack, and William Prevatel. We're going to be talking about our experiences at the AIA convention in Orlando last week, about the vote at the business meeting. This is a long interview, so we're going to jump right into it. I'll be playing that for you in just a moment.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
I am joined by three great guests this week. The first one is William Prevatel. William is a member of the American Institute of Architects. He's got a Bachelor of Architecture from Syracuse University, a Master's in Architecture and Urban Design from Columbia University, and a Diploma of Construction Management from New York University. He's been the sole proprietor of a private architecture practice since 1988. He's joined today by David Mack. David has 24 years experience in planning and urban analysis, design and construction management, project controls, financial analysis, contract administration, claims analysis and avoidance, real estate development, and infrastructure program management. He's an associate member of the AIA. We'll be learning more about these two great individuals in just a few moments. And they're joined this week by Ted Walter, who is the Director of Strategy and Development here at AE 9/11 Truth. He's also the lead author of Beyond Misinformation, What Science Says About the Destruction of World Trade Center Buildings 1, 2, and 7. We quote that book a lot on this show. Prior to working with AE 9/11 Truth, he's worked with a number of 9/11 related campaigns, including the High Rise Safety Initiative and the Remember Building 7 campaign. Guys, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Andy.
For having us.
So this is the first episode after the AIA convention in Orlando, Florida. But that's what we're getting together here to talk about. So we're going to lead off with Ted. And Ted, I want you to tell our audience, or describe for them, what our experience was at the AIA convention last week, especially with the vote at the business meeting.
Yeah, so first of all, the American Institute of Architects, which is the largest association of architects in the U.S., is something that Bill and David are both members of as architects and building professionals. They have their national convention every year around this time of year. And as many of the listeners know, we as an organization have been going there for the past 8 years, having a booth there, educating and kind of recruiting architects to be a part of our organization. The last few years, we have all the AIA members that are a part of AE 9/11 Truth have been sponsoring a resolution that calls upon the AIA to officially support a new investigation into the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7. And so this was our third year submitting that resolution. It's changed a little bit over the years, but essentially what the resolution does is lay out all of the evidence, or the most important evidence, regarding the collapse of Building 7 and makes the case that the AIA should make it their official position to support a new investigation. And in order to get this resolution submitted and considered at the annual business meeting of the AIA, you have to have at least 50 members of the AIA sponsoring the resolution. And so that's what we've been able to muster the last few years, is enough members to get this resolution put forward. 2 years ago, when it was our first year, we had the resolution that we submitted got 4% of the vote, and that was our first time kind of going at it, and we really had no idea what to expect. We managed to increase that vote share to 11% last year. So about 1 out of 9 of the delegates that were voting in the business meeting last year voted in favor of the resolution. We were hoping this year to continue that upward trajectory. As many of your listeners know, we were optimistic or hopeful that would be the case. And it ended up that we won 4% of the vote, similar to how we did 2 years ago. And so there's a lot of reasons for why we think that is, why we ended up going backwards in terms of the vote share. It was a very interesting experience. We learned a lot. This year was different in that the business meeting actually happened before the 3 days of the convention, whereas in previous years, the business meeting happened on the last day of the convention. So what we essentially had was a few days to kind of walk around and talk to all the delegates that voted on the resolution to find out, why they voted against it or for it. And we really learned a lot from that experience. So it was all in all, sort of a setback and a disappointment that we didn't win more of the vote. But there's also a lot of things for us to be satisfied with. I think first and foremost is the fact that really we're at a point where the entire AIA leadership is now aware of Building 7 and is aware of the questions surrounding it. And by and large, what we see is that most of these delegates, most of these AIA leaders are not really criticizing us or attacking us on the content of our argument. What we're really seeing is sort of a lack of will or indifference and just not wanting to get involved in the issue. But from talking to many of these members, we see that really a majority of them are really quite open and can see that there's some serious validity to our argument. And so the question is, should we continue trying to convince them that the AIA really has a responsibility here to speak up and take a position on this, given that many of them know that there are serious problems with the official story of Building 7's collapse?
It was a very interesting, eye-opening experience down there, and we're going to get into that here on this program today. We're going to take a step back, though, because we have two very good guests here on the program, and these two individuals actually spoke at the business meeting, along with Richard Gage, our founder and CEO. And I'm going to get their perspective on what happened. But first, I want our audience to get to know them. We know them, but some of our listeners might not. So we're going to start with William Prevatel. William, I gave a very brief intro. Please elaborate on that. Tell us essentially your story, your background, and how you came to be awake to this important issue that we talk about all the time here.
Yes, thank you. My background, as you mentioned, comes from Syracuse University, the architecture program, and I had done a number of years working with different firms after school, both upstate New York, and then probably about a dozen, because I always wanted to go for my own, about a dozen firms in Manhattan. It was small single practitioners up to SOM and HOK, and just getting some inside view there with some of these rather well-established firms. Also, following that, I taught a little bit at some of the schools in the New York area, New York Institute of Technology, Fashion Institute and Interior Design Department, and briefly some seminars at NYU, and as well as arbitrating some construction industry cases. And by arbitrating, that's essentially hearing cases between different parties. Could be an owner and a contractor, could be design professions and subcontractors or the owners, or a range of combinations, and hearing that and making decisions. So therefore trying to, not trained as a lawyer, but certainly spent many, many hours with lawyers presenting evidence and their case to me. Usually there'd be 2, sometimes 3 lawyers on each side of the table presenting to us. And that was a very, very informative experience, the probably a dozen or so years that I was arbitrating cases, as well as practicing, small practice in New York. And my experience with 9/11 was, and then while I was in New York, I did my master's in urban design, therefore had a particular consideration, particular concern for our urban context, and particularly larger compositions. I was aware of the towers and the World Trade Center complex in general, the complexity that went on underneath, the structural system up above. And when the towers were hit, in my case, I happened to get a call from my mother in the morning, who was calling from Connecticut, said, look at the news. I saw that there was a massive incident at the first tower. I went up onto the roof of my building at Midtown, saw the smoke and the rest of the situation. It was very visible on the skyline. Thought that this was a concern. Something of that magnitude was a great concern. At the same time, as I came down and realized that after the second plane had hit, and they started talking about closing off the city, I extracted myself from the city, and thinking that there might be some other incidents, or in my mind, particularly that there might have been anthrax somehow being distributed while people were locked onto the island, left for a number of hours, and then returned when there didn't seem to be any evidence or any acknowledgement or report of that. I went down to the site, my thinking being that having spent so much time out on the streets of New York, when you see sometimes a fender bender incident, it'll back up traffic for block after block and other little things. And when they have other events, they sort of cordon off areas. It becomes a challenging situation. And I figured that with the case of the towers collapsing, they really did have a situation that, how can I put it lightly? I had reservations about how it might be managed. So leave it at that. I did go down on the second evening, and went down to find that as I went there and to volunteer my services to the upper echelon of, I think it was the fire department that was there, the people that were in mostly white, to identify them. And they pointed out that, no, we can't do anything until we remove this walkway, the walkway that was going over the West Side Highway, and bridging from the Trade Center to the financial center. That would be the west side of the site. And I thought that was peculiar because there were basically 2 or 3 people welding, with like one piece of welding equipment, another person in front of us. This is down maybe it's 100 yards or so. But at the same time, there were hundreds of other uniformed professionals sort of standing around. And I didn't really take that as being the answer for my time down there. And I circumnavigated that group, hundreds of people that were there, and continued around the rest of the site. And during that first visit of that 24-hour site, circumnavigated the site twice, really experienced a great deal of the scope of what had gone on. And for my time there, I did meet with FEMA teams, try to brief them on what the geometric, the before and after conditions were, where they might be able to find cavities to search. A lot of them showed up and didn't realize that there was space down below, because it just looked like a pile of debris, and you couldn't really tell that there was this major urban complex below. And I cordoned off structural hazards, of which there were many. People were unconscious or unaware of passing underneath steel that had not previously been there, that had lawn darted off of the towers themselves into the surrounding area, and were not necessarily vertical. They were at various angles that could have fallen over any time, or they could possibly last 100 years. We just didn't know. So I had a lot of those locations, a lot of those components cordoned off. I warned people of the airborne asbestos, of which I knew there was a great deal in the air. And when you see the lights on at night, the rescue lights on at night, it was like it was snowing. It was really thick and very, very visible. And as I mentioned briefly during the AIA presentation, I did searching. I helped others. I led some searching, as well as doing it on my own, and passed some unfortunate situations, body parts and such, and even had the, let's call it the honor of helping to assist bodies off the pile with the fire department. And they have a certain sort of procedure for doing that when the bodies were found. So, and I could mention it in a moment, my experience that after going around the site, about the last part of this 360-degree circle was looking north to Building 7 from the elevated plaza. I'd gone up the stairway, I think it's Fulton Street, that borders the north side of the original complex. And as I went up and I looked to the left, there was absolute chaos of the plaza site and debris everywhere. And you could see the the dented up globe that remained, but quite well dented and still embedded in a lot of the dust and airborne matter that was there. But as I looked to my right, even though I knew that the building had supposedly been emptied of people, that was the assumption in every worked off of that it was a non-issue, I looked to Building 7 and saw this rather incredibly intriguing pile of debris. And I knew I was there to look for people and to try to find survivors, and this was not an issue, but I kept having to turn my head, and I'm forcing myself to go, you have to get off and keep searching, but I kept looking back to the Building 7, and I just couldn't believe it. I had to take a moment to see that I couldn't see any major damage to surrounding buildings. The building barely spread to the surrounding street area. It folded in on itself. There was little or no smoke coming from the building. And it just struck me as I remember thinking to myself that, the stories that came down because of the planes hitting the towers, and the towers then created some debris to create a fire to take this down. But I very clearly thought to myself in a very short time that a controlled demolition could not have done it any better. And that brings us to here, where some years later things have set in, and I'm pretty well convinced that it didn't come down naturally, and that it was a controlled demolition, and a well-executed controlled demolition.
David, elaborate on your background and tell us how you came to be involved in the 9/11 issue.
Well, my story is not as compelling as Bill's. I don't have any personal experience with the event as Bill does. My background is simply a bachelor's degree in architecture from Notre Dame, and I began my career with a design-build firm in Dallas, Texas, and very quickly began a career that has taken me widely across the United States, including New York City. I worked for the Eggers Group, a prominent firm of many years at 2 Park Avenue in Midtown. Had occasion to become acquainted with some prominent structural engineers, including Erwin Cantor briefly, Fred Severid, and others, and certainly followed the events. I'm actually sitting in the office where my wife alerted me to the events, and I watched them on a nearby monitor, so that's all kind of coincidental. Became first aware of 9/11 truth. And I will say that I probably accepted the official story for many, many years, due in part to my followed some of the comments made by Mr. Cantor early on and left it alone, kind of left it at that. I had occasion to meet Richard last year here in Orlando, had occasion to become acquainted, had dinner with Richard at his preview of the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth viewing here in Orlando, and was very happy to lend some personal support to Richard again here in Orlando recently. And I believe that was helpful to me to understand, take the temperature, if you will, of the AIA in Washington and the AIA here in Orlando, which is probably not atypical from other chapters across the country. They're not excited about, as Ted said, a lack of will to do much except stand by or deflect attention to the NIST report, which is clearly not credible. So in that respect, they don't attempt to refute or talk about our concerns. Many of them are obviously probably aware, but unwilling to speak out. So the opportunity to accompany Richard across the span of several days at the expo, primarily listen, I'm an analytic, to many of the rank-and-file AIA members who clearly are busy with their lives making a living in a difficult economy. This is probably not top of mind. So when they are shown some of, especially what occurred at Building 7, for many it's really the first time they've really taken a look at the evidence, which is very compelling. And so although we may not have done more than create an awareness with the upper 300 or so members of AIA and the most prominent chapters across the country, there are many, many many architects yet to wake up to the realities of Building 7 and what those implications are and, where they might lead. So I'm happy to see that Richard's efforts, and he is a very hardworking individual, exhausting just to follow him. This is an important message to share with others.
It absolutely is, and I just want to say that's a very good point that you made just now about how it's the upper groups who are the delegates, but we've done a lot to educate the AIA membership overall. I was so proud when Richard was talking to a architect, a woman from Indiana, and she started to hand out a brochure, or he started to hand out a brochure to her, the one with Dan Barnum on it, and she said she had received it already and reviewed it. And so that goes to show you all the great hard work going on here at AE 911 Truth from our volunteers, getting that information to share the evidence with the AIA's overall membership. Ted, we're going to move to you now because, like I said earlier, our supporters want to know more about our experience there at the AIA. So can you describe what went on during the business meeting, your own observations?
Sure. Well, I would say that there's been quite an evolution over the last few years of how the resolution that we have been submitting has been received by the delegates and by the by the national AIA board. 2 years ago, in 2015 in Atlanta, we were rather vociferously attacked over the resolution. The tone of the AIA board's position was very, sort of loudly in support of the official story, in support of the NIST report on Building 7. And several members of the national board stood up to oppose the resolution and called us conspiracy theorists, frankly, and said that we should just simply accept that diesel fuel fires brought down Building 7. Why are we having trouble accepting this? The member that made that comment didn't even realize that diesel fuel fires were not a part of the official story. So that was kind of what we're up against at that time, a combination of ignorance and disdain. The tone has changed considerably since then, and we really saw the change last year. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that we started doing more mailings, both to the AIA membership overall, as well as the leadership, and also the change to the resolution that we made last year, where we decided to actually outline the evidence within the text of the resolution. And so we were quoting people talking about explosions. We were quoting Danny Jawenko, a demolition expert, saying that it was clearly a controlled demolition. All of these things are in the resolution text. And it made it much harder for the leadership and the delegates in general to just slam us and say, you guys are conspiracy theorists, because if anybody who read it and had even a remotely open mind could see that there's probably some validity to the case that we were making. And so it really changed to last year was really just them plugging their ears and trying to ignore it. In spite of that, we still managed to get 11% of the vote last year. And as I said before, I think that had to do with the mailings. It had to do with changing the resolution language. It also had to do with the fact that we had spent 2 days at the expo and had hundreds of architects come to our booth and watch the video of Building 7, talk to us. Many of the people that came to our booth were delegates who were kind of like undecided about how to vote on the resolution. This year, we didn't have the benefit of that, those 2 days to get the message out and build support. Also, because the business meeting was the day before the convention actually started, it was less attended. There was about 10% fewer delegates there. And chances are the people that bothered to show up a day before the convention to participate in the business meeting are sort of the more upper crust of the AIA leadership, who you would imagine on average would be less likely to support this resolution, to support the idea of the AIA getting behind a new investigation. So the reception that we got this year, rather than just trying to plug the ears and ignore it, I got more of a sense of like they heard us, we've gotten the message through to them, and now it's just basically an indifference. Or the most common, and this came up, and we interviewed probably about 24 delegates that voted at the business meeting in the days after the business meeting at the expo. And the most common response that we got, probably like around 10 or 20% of them said, I just disagree. I don't think it was a controlled demolition. I think fire could have brought down that building. But the vast majority of them didn't say that. And probably around half of them said that there was some validity or there's some serious questions or that it was obvious to them that it was controlled demolition. The objection that we met, that we see that these people seem to be voicing in general, or various iterations of it, was that this is not an issue for the AIA. Why should we take a stand on this? What about the engineers? What about the structural engineers? And as I said, there were different shades of this kind of response. So one person's view was, what good would it really do if the AIA officially supported a new investigation? Would it really have that much of an impact? I think for us, as far as we're concerned, given the battles that we fight day in and day out, in our view, it would be a significant step forward. It's not going to be a game changer, but it would be a very significant step forward. Other versions of that kind of objection are that we don't specialize in this. We're not structural engineers. Shouldn't they take it on? Of course, if you talk to an AIA member, we talk to many who are not delegates as well. One person who is aware of the issue has been aware of it for a long time. He's very involved in the Cleveland chapter of the AIA, said, of course the AIA could take this on. Why not? This has to do with buildings. There clearly something is wrong here. And it's basically a cop-out to say that, this is not something that the AIA should take on. So that's really where the debate is and really where the opposition is. And if we are to try this in the future, the only way that we could have any success or make any progress if we determine that it's worth it is if we figure out how to meet that objection that this is something that the AIA should not take on. The discussion has moved way beyond, is this a controlled demolition or not? Can fires really bring down this building? A majority of the people in that room know that fires could not have brought down that building. And the question is, how do we get them to care? Why do they not care? Why do they not think it's something that they should take action on? And Bill and David's speeches were very much revolving around that issue of, this is a matter of our professional integrity. This is a matter of following our conscience. And yet the 96% of the delegates in that room went directly against what Bill and David were talking about, which is unfortunate.
It does seem like they were towing the line with the recommendation of the board. It's not necessarily that they wanted to, but I think there was a sentiment to sort of move forward. And regardless of any evidence, part of it might be, particularly this year, and regardless of what side of the political spectrum you're on, that there are some very very interesting distractions going on today as well. My position is some of what went on back in 2001 might give some insight to today, and there might be some connectivity. We're getting very good as a society of fooling ourselves, and if we keep doing that enough, at some point nothing will matter. It's sort of this beating up on truth, and the people themselves get beat up on. And every day there's another incident or revelation that comes out that becomes another distraction, and it takes our focus off some really important matters. And it's rather unfortunate.
Right. It's constantly first with regard to what William is saying right there, totally. I mean, as we get further away from the incident, other things happen. They steal the public's attention, and people get focused on those things without having the wisdom to look back to 9/11 and realizing that a lot of what we're dealing with now has stemmed from this event. And of course, there's problems with the official story when it comes to the towers. So that's why this is so important for people who care about current events. I also think, too, we're doing a really good job considering we're always the visiting team. And what I mean by that is I talk about home field advantage in most sports because you have the crowd with you, you have the turf, the field, you've been practicing on it the whole season. And so we go into a situation, they deny our exhibit booth, they change the guidelines for submitting the resolution with regard to the co-sponsors pretty close to the deadline, so we have to redo all of our paperwork. We even have the board essentially stating at the very beginning of debate on the resolution that they will not support it, that they don't support it. So you don't have even the endorsement of the AIA being indifferent or for the resolution, like a lot of other resolutions do. And there's a lot of weight associated with this issue, obviously, because of the tragedy that happened that day. So I'm very happy. I mean, yes, we did have 4% this year, but a lot of people already knew this. And what Ted said is totally worth pointing out is that a lot of these people's objections had very little to do with the evidence and more to do with whether or not the AIA should be involved in this. All of these little human concerns that are important to address, but don't really refute anything that we're saying. So I'm very happy with that. I'm going to ask you guys, William and David, to talk about some of those interactions that you had on the convention floor in the days following. We had folks going around finding the little green dots on AIA members' badges that signified that they were delegates, and asking them politely why they didn't vote for the resolution. And I looked at some of those notes that you guys took, and I want our audience to hear about it too. So we're going to start with William and then David. Tell us about some of the interactions that you guys had.
Just to backtrack a little bit, at the business meeting, I found it really rather disheartening that they introduced the topic, the particular resolution. It's nicely done. It's formal and such. So they find out if there's a cost factor. And in the case of the Building 7 investigation, there was little or no cost involved, which was great. However, at that same time, they then announced the position of the board of directors. And therefore, any presentation after that already has a bias to it. The viewer, who may not be familiar with the topic, whatever the resolution might be, is already in that position to go, okay, I should vote for this or I should vote against this. And every word that comes out of the presentation is going to have that sort of taint to it. And that's very disheartening. I really think that if we had a chance to make the presentation or our three presentations and even hear the counterpoint from the audience, I think people would have had a much better perspective on things and a much more positive outcome for supporting what we were trying to do with the resolution. And I think this sort of guiding the results, which I guess is not that uncommon in a political environment, but it really, to me, was disheartening and disingenuous in a way to do that and to think that we still had a free vote, that the people still had a free vote. Now, the experiences on site ranged quite a bit. I think there were some professionals, but not too many, that had a good grip on what had happened back in 2001. And some people I had run into had signed the statements and such in support of the investigation, and were well aware and were very, very strong in their support. And said, of course, this has to be supported. This really needs investigation. There were some people, and they weren't too familiar, but in particular, I'd like to point out that a lot of the incoming people to the profession, a lot of the younger people, some that I spoke to that were in school, some that were recently out of school and with other firms, were not so familiar at all. Some zero understanding that there was a third tower that had gone down. And I think the word really needs to get through to those people. I think they may be, once they start to hear something like that, they may start to put the dots together and draw a better conclusion of what we need to do. But right now, I think they're really quite uninformed despite efforts to date. And as we go forward, we're putting more years behind some of these people. At some point, they will not have been born when this took place. We're almost at that point where people entering school, they were not conscious at the time of the towers being hit. So that's a concern. I even hit some people that were not necessarily architects or engineers, just to bounce off it, having there was a third tower that went down, and had no idea, zero idea at all. And they feed a little bit of information to them about it, and it's an absolute revelation. And saying, well, how come nobody knows about this? They're kind of mad that why wouldn't this be a more pronounced issue? And I got to say one more thing that amongst the many people that I spoke with, as I was going through the exhibit hall, I happened to pass by the AISC, I guess, American Institute of Steel Construction, and spoke with a couple of representatives there. They were very generous with their time. Spoke with, let's call it the more junior, and by junior I mean he was probably in his 40s or 50 or so, and a more senior member, let's say maybe in his 60s. And as I asked some questions, I said, you must be very interested. You're the Steel Institute. You represent steel, the strength of steel, the integrity of steel, all the good benefits you can get from using steel in construction. And I said, you must be outraged, to sort of put it on a platter for them. You must be outraged that this steel-framed building came down so quickly, so symmetrically, uncharacteristically of the reason you would use Steele. And the younger person stayed kind of quiet, kind of with a grin, kind of knowing that everything that I was bringing up was a concern and that he didn't have an answer for it and was sort of biting his lip. The senior ward gentleman, no matter what I said, sort of just stuck with the official story. Wasn't really interested in hearing that, well, it's just a coincidence, this and this, and circumstantial, and did not in any way give any leeway to other possibilities. And he held very, very tightly to that, regardless of some really obvious concerns that there were. And it really, when you start to go through these different incidents and the observations of how the steel behaved, steel frame building, steel connectors and such, how it behaved, you would go, wow, if I'm doing a high-rise structure, we better stay away from using steel because some relatively small fires, a relatively short period of time, brought it down. That maybe there are some other ways of doing this. So I found that interesting that he still supported the official line. And my position is I think steel does not behave that way. That I would think that things would have twisted and turned and racked. There would have been a much different result from a random collapse.
Right. And now, David, tell us about some of your interactions on the convention floor with delegates in the days following the business meeting.
Well, I guess I would start by saying this is the first time I've been to quite a number of AIA annual conventions. Now they call it a conference. This is the first time I served as a voting delegate, and I think any attempt, if you desire in the future to bring back the idea of a resolution, would by necessity include more focus on the delegate selection process and an attempt to stimulate greater participation by like-minded people like ourselves. I think Bill touched on a very important aspect of the convention in his description of what he encountered at the AISC booth. The question arises, the call of the day was, what do each individual actually have to lose by supporting such a resolution? And of course, it's probably not a coincidence, as Bill says, that, they stay close to the official story. So an attempt perhaps to outreach to emerging professionals might be more productive. And I also want to say that I do agree with Ted that the lack of a booth, or an exhibit rather, and the unfortunate scheduling of the general business meeting were probably key ingredients in the poor performance of the resolution, outside of the obvious disinterest of the board members. We were unable to reach a changing panorama, if you will, of rank and file members who don't necessarily attend every annual convention or conference. They're limited to perhaps attending a conference every so often when it happens to occur in their region. So you're talking to a totally different rank and file audience in Orlando as compared to Philadelphia, as compared to the West Coast, for instance. So, those are all things to consider, reasons not to lose hope for the long term. This is a journey. When this is another chapter in the journey.
Absolutely. Well, I haven't lost hope, and I said earlier about how we've educated so many people about this issue. The only thing we have to overcome now are the political and very human obstacles that we've dealt with the general public, and we've been dealing with it, and we'll continue to. Ted, I want your observations and stories on your interactions with delegates in the days following, too, but I also want you to address some of these very common reasons that delegates didn't vote for the resolution, according to them, mainly that it's not an AIA issue. Also, the idea that we need to just move on. It was 16 years ago, and it's time to move forward.
Sure, Andy. So, yeah, I spoke to some of these reasons, some of these objections that delegates gave before. Another shade of that kind of objection of, this is not the right thing for us to take on, is that the idea that it's time to move on. And it's really, to me, that's always puzzling. And it's such an obvious cop-out. I mean, if that's genuinely how somebody feels, that's fine. But taking that position, on an intellectual level, it's akin to saying that we shouldn't study history, or that our understanding of past events has no bearing on the present. And that's just totally absurd and intellectually baseless. So it's always disappointing when people say that. And really, it's just an obvious cop-out to say, I don't want to think about this issue because it makes me uncomfortable, or I don't feel comfortable with my professional association speaking out on this issue. And that is fundamentally what is the debate here, or what people are voting on. I think it's really important for all of our supporters and everybody who cares about this issue to not be discouraged about this, and to realize that what these delegates are voting on is not, do we think that Building 7 is a controlled demolition or not? These 300 or 400 delegates are voting on whether they want their institute to take a stand on this issue. And, they have varying degrees of comfort or support for the issue, varying degrees of awareness, et cetera. But when it comes down to it, that's what they're voting on. And unfortunately, these people are custodians of their institute. And the real question, and I think David hit this in our discussions about it last week, was the bottom line is this good for the AIA to take a position on? Even if the AIA takes a position on something that's not clearly about architecture, if it's a more social or political subject, there's always a calculation. Is this good for the AIA? Is this a position that will reflect well on the AIA? And, the 400 delegates in that room, what they're asking in their mind, what will it mean if the AIA comes out and does the right thing and supports the new Building 7 investigation? And unfortunately, the people in that room think that that wouldn't be good for the AIA. That's the calculation. Now, Bill?
Oh, well, just picking up where Ted is, I think it's simply a case of you want to know what went on, because so often we have history repeating itself, and quite often that history repeats itself due to ignorance, and people didn't fully understand the ramifications of certain actions, or certain or people evaded information, or they distorted the information, and it comes back to bite humanity later on. And I think we may be setting ourselves up for one of those situations now. Quite disturbingly, that I think there was a time, maybe through the 70s and after the Watergate hearings and such, and people, our society, American society, was a little bit more aware of trying to get to the bottom of things. And so that going forward for a number of years afterwards, there was a great sensitivity to trying to determine what was, lack of a better word, truthful. That was, the broader story. And now we seem to be setting ourselves up for the position that, there's every story and any story, and you can make up the story of the day on the same issue, and it's all acceptable and all equally acceptable. And I think this organization and a lot of the people that signed on to it don't want, necessarily any story. They want the best story, the best explanation possible. Not a story. They really want the best factual explanation of what has gone on. And with that, you have solid ground to go forward as a society.
Well, I agree completely. This idea that the AIA should not be involved is like saying the AMA should not care about Ebola. This is right up their alley. This has to do with structures, with buildings, with the field of study that they chose to pursue, and the fact that they just look the other way or find these other reasons. Because, again, they didn't really take us on any evidence points at that business meeting. There wasn't really much to be said in opposition against us. It was all focused on these outside concerns. In my view, they're outside concerns. Again, we're not asking the AIA to even do an investigation. We're simply looking for them to acknowledge the controversy and say it should be investigated again by the proper authorities, which I believe is in their place. Go ahead.
I had phrased this to some of the members and even some of the more senior people, saying this is simply a matter of getting a second opinion. And let's put it in medical terms. You have a loved one that has a certain condition or situation. You're not too sure what it is. It may not look too good, and it may be causing them pain, and they have a lot of downtime. And you go to a particular medical professional, and they say, "Oh, it's nothing," or they just say it's this or it's that. It's the time of the year. It's the weather. It's something. And you go home and you realize, your loved one still has the same condition. Well, you're probably not going to say, well, that's good enough. The situation may be getting worse, or you could see that it is something serious, and you want a second opinion. You want to go to another professional to determine what this is, and get that full explanation. And for them not to be open to this full explanation, to at least take a position to say, it's better to have more information on something than less, and to specifically exclude information, the potential for information, is very, very disturbing. It's like saying, sure, well, just let your family member, die of whatever it is, or have it continue and pass on to other family members. You don't want that. You want to find out what it is as soon as possible, and if there is some sort of treatment or course of action, you want to take that.
Now, in our last couple of minutes here, I'm going to give the floor to Ted. Ted, any final thoughts, speaking to our supporters and many listeners here, regarding the AIA convention? Anything that you wanted to make sure got said or that may have been left out in our description of our experience there? Please share with the audience.
Yeah, well, I guess I would say that this is, the AIA is one front among many fronts that we are working on. It would certainly help a lot if we could get the AIA on board supporting a new investigation. I think we have a lot of questions to ask and some soul searching and some serious evaluation to determine basically a cost benefit analysis of the amount of work that goes into this kind of campaign, and whether we want to do it again, or maybe we need to focus our efforts on the rank and file of the architecture profession. We've been very successful in educating these particular members that vote on these resolutions. They're all fully aware. Well, I won't say fully, because some of them have not taken the time to even watch the video, but they're fully aware that this issue exists, and perhaps we need to work in getting more of the uninformed rank and file architects out there to support this. But that's a tremendous amount of effort as well. But the main message here is that this is one front among many fronts that we are working on currently. And I don't think we're going to give up on this front. We have seen a lot of progress in various ways, maybe not just in the percentages on the vote, but in various ways we've seen very positive progress. So I just say, keep on fighting. And, David said it and Bill said it, like, this is just one step in a long journey. So, and I'd be curious to know what David and Bill have to say about it too, because they're the architects.
Yeah, please, guys.
I don't have too much to add. Certainly, financial support is important, and I think focusing on that need to sustain ourselves is important. I also think it's important that more of our listening audience become active. I can only tell you how beneficial it was for me to come out and spend time, some quality time with Richard, quality time with Ted, with Andy, Kelly, and Bill and others, and some things that I saw that I'm hopeful will lead to some compromise, even between AE 9/11 Truth and the upper ranks of the AIA. I think we laid some groundwork. We've extended our hand, and despite the bias that I think was shown to us, and hopefully we can have some common establish some common ground rules. I think they respect our freedom of speech. I think they respect, even if it's silently, our point of view. Obviously, these individuals have much more at stake than others in the AIA. So I wouldn't expect anything but what we received, and I would expect a new resolution would probably meet the same headwinds. But all in all, the experience was great. I enjoyed seeing some of my classmates from Notre Dame. Richard and I had the opportunity to attend the Notre Dame alumni reception with Dean Michael Licautis, who's a lovely man who I've met on one other occasion here in Orlando about 10 years ago. He remembered me. We were able to meet the new incoming, not incoming, but future president of the AIA, fellow AIA, Bill Bates, a wonderful gentleman, and others. So in that spirit of friendship, we continue to shoulder on and, use the personal feelings we have toward one another to bolster what we're doing going forward, and hope and pray for the best.
Bill?
I agree. I had a very nice experience. I really appreciate the people that were dedicated towards this concern, as David mentioned. I think what occurred to me was that time is passing, and there is this whole new generation that is not very aware of, they were vaguely aware even of 9/11 itself. And of course they have the image of the couple planes hitting the towers and the towers coming down. And at this point, that may be really almost all of their understanding and the official storyline behind it. I think it's going to be very important to get to to this newer generation that's going through school right now, because I think it's something that's very much missing. And I remember when I was in school or thereabouts. I know there was thereabouts. It may have actually happened after I was in school. The hotel, it was somewhere in the central part of the country, possibly St. Louis or so, that would have the walkways suspended, and that became a great example of how the rods were not continuous, and the joining and such therefore created a failure. At first, you look at it and you think, "Oh, that's how it should be able to stay up. The original design should be able to stay up because of this change for the convenience of constructing those walkways." And in the end, you go, "Oh my goodness, oh my God, what a failure that would result in because of this very minor change." And that becomes an example that just the positioning of these bolts and the rods, and the continuity of the rods and such, and that becomes a great example for students understanding structures. I don't know, I can't say for sure, and I don't think it has been a topic of conversation amongst the structural engineering classes, both in the engineering programs and in the architecture programs. This should be something of note, worthy of at least a few minutes to discuss the steel frame building coming down as it did. I go back to the steel people, and I have a feeling that had I approached them saying, "We have a new project coming up, we're going to put up a high-rise building, should we use steel?" I bet they'd go on all day of the merits of steel, and how if there was a single column or two that gave way, that it would not take the entire building down, and it would behave this way in the fire, and it would do all these wonderful things and sustain itself. And that's what they would have pitched to me. I had to ask them the question of why it didn't, and they held the line. But I have a feeling that given the same parameters, they would have supported and say, "No, it doesn't do this, and no, it doesn't do that. It works much better." So, in short, though, I would like to see going to more of the schools. Maybe you'll get an invigorated generation. Their means of communicating, social networks and such, is so much different from what many of us of an older generation are used to. and maybe that's a way of taking a bit of a leap forward on this particular project. Otherwise, I think we'll get for various reasons, you'll have the core of AIA towing the line, trying to avoid any distraction, trying to avoid the possibility of people, entities, groups, companies, whatever being singled out or identified as being somewhat responsible for the failure of Building 7. And I think they want to avoid that. They I believe, would feel like they're losing ground. They have, as they said, their own sort of battles, new battles that they have going forward. But, I still go back and think, is there any harm in asking for a second opinion and just leave it at that? And it could have been very easy for them to just say, yeah, okay, we'll support you. Second opinion, we don't have to put a dime out. That's fine. Here you go. Goodbye. And yet they still didn't do that. They still, wouldn't accommodate a second opinion, which is concerning to me.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I just want to say it was nice getting to know you guys at the convention throughout the whole week there. Ted, of course, always. And so, guys, thank you for what you did down there. Thank you for coming on the show to share your experiences, and ever upward. We're going to be doing more things, and I have no doubt one day they're going to look back and realize that AE 9/11 Truth and all our great supporters and all the listeners of this program were on the right side of history. So everyone's going to be vindicated. Just stay the course. So thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Andy.
This program is on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also keep track of the archives by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.